would like to welcome all of you. For those of you who I did not meet over the last 7 years, I'm Keith Geckeler. I am the former Stated Clerk of the Presbytery. I am now honorably retired, but one of my last items was to come back and do this workshop as part of the open space time. My understanding from those who requested it was that they wanted some help for individual members who are in congregations that may or may not seek to be dismissed to another denomination. What will happen to them if their congregation does seek dismissal and is granted dismissal? What do you do as a member and you want to remain with the Presbyterian Church USA? So that's basically the task we're going to be tackling. I'm going to try to give the answers. This is not a typical polity question that takes an hour and a half to answer. It's a lot easier because there just aren't a lot of options out there and don't need to be. So let me start in. There are essentially, if you are somebody in this context or you are a pastor who may have members who will be asking this question, or you're an elder on a session, whatever. There are essentially three basic options. Unless in our conversations today we find that there's a fourth that I'm not aware of, all right, which has been known to happen. The first item would be if your church is granted dismissal and you do not want to go to another denomination, you like the Presbyterian Church USA, your first option is to find another church within the Presbytery of Los Ranchos where you would be able to transfer your membership. That would be a very simple process, just like anybody who's moving from one congregation to another. You find a church, you request that your membership be transferred. The other session votes to receive you as a member, and the clerks communicate, and you are transferred. Pretty simple. Any questions about that process? Okay? That's the easy one. The second one is a little more convoluted, but it is an option. If you come up to, let's say, the church is about to be dismissed, and you really haven't found a congregation that you want to belong to, or as somebody has phrased it, at that point, I'm a little nervous that I might go to a congregation that is also seeking to be dismissed, or likely to seek dismissal within a year or so. And so I'm not sure I want to make that commitment. The option will be under the provisions of the form of government for presbyteries. When a congregation is dissolved, and dismissal is somewhat parallel for that in terms of the actual consequences within the denomination, you may have your membership transferred to the presbytery. And the presbytery would hold your membership until such time as you find a congregation where you want to belong, and then your membership will be transferred to that congregation. Now we do this in two other situations. That's why there's a precedent and a parallel to this. We do it with new church developments. When a new church development is starting, people who choose to become part of that new church development, they can have their membership in the presbytery. Then when the church is chartered, all of those people who have been on the presbytery rolls as members of a congregation are transferred to the congregation. The other option is with those churches where we dissolve the congregation. We're closing one. The members, for whatever reason, do not want to move their membership yet. They're just not ready to give it up or whatever else. Their membership, when the church is closed, anyone who has not transferred, their membership automatically goes to the presbytery. Because all of the minutes, all of the roll books from a closed church go to the presbytery. And you are kept on the membership of the presbytery until such time as you notify the presbytery that you would like to be transferred to Church X, that's where you have decided to belong. Now, when you go to the presbytery, this is not a for eternity motion, all right? And I'm going to warn you ahead of time. The reality is that this is one of those lists that people come and go in a presbytery office, and after a certain length of time, the fact that the presbytery holds this list of members will have been forgotten. So if you are seeking to have your membership transferred and you call the presbytery office, they're going to say, right, why do we have your membership? And you can say, well, you closed my church or my church got dismissed. Okay, so what? They have forgotten, and they may not even know where that list is. So you probably want to make sure that you transfer, let's say, somewhere between 2 and 4 years maximum. You need to find another congregation that you can be part of. Okay, everybody with me on those first two options? Okay. Those are the easy, non-controversial, etc., etc., etceteras. The third option is the one that's, it is politically charged. And I'm going to say it up front so you hear it and you know what it is. In a congregation, if there are a sufficient number of you who decide you do not want to move to another denomination, you can organize and request to be heard by the presbytery as the potential, quote, true church in that particular congregation. It's part of chapter 4 of our form of government. And let me read it to you so you know where I'm coming from on this one. It's G 4.0207. The relationship to the Presbyterian Church USA of a congregation can be severed only by constitutional action on the part of the presbytery. And that would be the dismissal. If there is a schism within the membership of a congregation, and the presbytery is unable to effect a reconciliation, or a division into separate congregations within the Presbyterian Church USA, the presbytery shall determine if one of the factions is entitled to the property because it is identified by the presbytery as the true church within the Presbyterian Church USA. This determination does not depend upon which faction received the majority vote within the congregation at the time of the schism. All right, so you know exactly what the constitutional basis for what I'm going to talk to you on. It means that most likely, if you are 5 people in a church of 250, you could try to exercise that option, but off the cuff, I'm going to say it's probably not going to get a serious consideration. There's only a handful of you in a congregation. You probably need to be looking at one of the first 2 options. If you are what you would consider a substantial minority within the life of the congregation, and I'm not going anywhere near defining what a substantial minority is, because the Constitution does not state what that is. But if there is a substantial minority who believe they want to remain in the Presbyterian Church USA, that they believe the congregation ought to remain in the PCUSA, and they want to keep the property as part of a member of the PCUSA, then they can petition the presbytery to be heard as the minority voice within a schism. And I'm sorry, but that's the language that's in the Book of Order, so it's the language I use. You may not like it, but that's where it is. So if there's that kind of a split, it's up to do, and at that point, as part of our whole process for the discernment, there's a process in there where the discernment teams would then meet with the minority group, would have conversations, and would work, as it said above, to find out, is there a way to mediate a division, or is there a way to divide in two congregations, both of which are part of the PCUSA, or are they going to have to recommend to the presbytery that one group or the other be given the property? Now, with that, it's a reminder, only the presbytery can make that decision. No small group, no commission can be granted that authority. Only the presbytery can make the decision as to which group would receive the property and be declared the PCUS congregation. All right? Or would be dismissed and the other group told, you need to find either another congregation that all of you can become part of, or you can also approach the presbytery and say, there are 50 of us, and that's a pretty good start on a new church development. And we may want to talk to the presbytery about the 50 or 75 of us becoming a new church development within the presbytery. But there's a lot of flexibility in there, but that is essentially the third option, is for that group of people to make the decision. That's it, folks. There are three options, okay? Now, if you have others, I'm open to hear those, or I'll take questions.
I'm very new at this, the whole process. However, is there some time frame when this would need to take place for this option 3 to happen?
The option 3 is once the discernment process is up and running. That should be as soon and as quickly as possible, because the discernment teams need to know that there is a minority within this congregation who may be seeking to stay within the Presbyterian Church USA, even though the congregation has asked to be, and I got to be very precise with my language here, 9 of the churches have asked to be dismissed. Their information to the presbytery was very clear that they are seeking dismissal. 2 of the churches have made clear that they are entering a discernment process and have not yet made a decision what they want to do. So with that said, the sooner the discernment team knows that there is a group within the congregation with whom they need to meet separately to hear their concerns and their issues, the better for everybody. The last thing you want is to go through the next 9 months, and next May's presbytery meeting, there's a motion to dismiss Congregation X, and a week before that presbytery meeting, 50 people show up and say, we're going to protest at the presbytery meeting because we don't want the church to be dismissed. A little late in the game, all right? So get in as quickly as possible. If you know there are other people right now, get together and let the presbytery know. All right? Let me go here, Bill, and that there, and then we'll come back up.
Do you know of any precedent that's been recent in other churches that have gone through option 3?
There are at least 2. There was, the one actually wasn't that. The one that I know in Colorado that went through the process for seeking to be dismissed, and they got to the final meeting, and the majority of the congregation turned out. It was like a 55-60% voted to stay in the denomination. There's one other, and I can't remember where it is, where the minority was granted the property. It's not a common, but it has happened. Pardon? Well, Torrance, it wasn't related to this, but the Torrance Korean Church is a classic context for where the minority was granted the property. Tom?
Yeah, the substantial minority that you mentioned, what are its responsibilities to communicate with the session of their congregation?
They should communicate. They need to let them know that they're going to approach the presbytery.
Every step of the way?
Yeah, I would. The more transparent you can keep the process, the healthier it's going to be for everybody. Now that's my 40 years of ministry speaking and not my former stated clerk hat, okay? Otherwise we start turning this into an adversarial and all those other things that we've been trying to avoid all along the line, okay? Phil?
When you speak of the minority being able to voice their concerns, will there be some timeline? In other words, like you say, if you come up 5 minutes before the time that things supposedly were in order and ready for dismissal, and they raise the question, would that be a valid dissent at that time? Or is that part of the process that needs to be timelined?
It is valid given the policy that we're working with, okay? Is it advisable? No. The sooner that voice can be brought into the open and made clear, the healthier it's going to be for everybody, and especially the healthier it's going to be for the discernment process. Because it could be that the congregation has been meeting off and on for the last year or so and has no idea that, say, 20% of the members don't want to leave the denomination. They've been quiet or haven't been at meetings or whatever, for whatever reason, and they haven't spoken up. And it would be awfully helpful for the rest of the congregation to know there's some folk who have different opinions. That's what happened in the Colorado church. It was a unanimous session, all of the pastoral staff. They had 3 or 4 meetings with pretty substantial, and then all of a sudden a group of folk decided this isn't where we want to go. And they began to speak out, and like I said, in the end it turned out about 60% voted to stay within the denomination. Let me come over here, Phil, and then we'll...
Two questions. When you're talking about the team that would meet with the 50 people,
Well,
whatever the number,
could be 5.
are you talking about the joint discernment team, or are you talking about the Presbyterian representative?
The joint discernment team. Now it may be, the policy is flexible here, okay? It may be that the Presbytery in its wisdom decides it wants its 4 people to meet with these individuals first, okay? Because in most cases, the Presbytery has not been invited into any of the conversations that have been being held in churches. And it may be those individuals ask only for Presbytery. It's up to the folk who put together the discernment teams and put that process into motion. And I can't tell you what they're going to do.
And the second question is maybe option number 4. Could that minority decide that they would like to form a PCUSA church on their own and go ahead and move forward that way, and they don't care about the property?
Oh, that's what I was saying, was the one I talked about. That would be a new church development. When you say on their own, a reminder, that means with the Presbytery. Okay. Howard.
Do you anticipate, 1, a secret ballot, 2, a controlled vote of the congregations with members only that are present at the time of the vote to determine where this is going?
Okay. A reminder, folk. Presbyterian Polity 101. The congregation may not vote to be dismissed. That is not a power that a congregation has. And so there is never a vote to be dismissed. Okay, everybody clear on that? All right, make sure we got that one. There can be poll votes to have a congregational gathering and have people vote in some manner to indicate what is the percentage of people who do want to seek dismissal. All right? That can be handled any way the church chooses to, because it's not a congregational meeting, it is not subject to Robert's rules. The session can determine whatever process the church determines is the best way for them to go about determining the will of the body.
Okay, so then the session will essentially make the decisions on behalf of the church.
The session will make the request to the presbytery. Right, it's a request from the session.
So then if there is a substantial minority, it behooves them to get together and decide what their position shall be.
As early as possible. Okay? Phil, you had another one?
It is, it kind of runs along that line of how do we reconcile the different needs or desires of those who would like to stay versus those who would like to leave, if we're saying that the session has to request, but the dissenting group can protest. So how do we balance those, if you will?
In the end, you may not be able to. It may come down to the presbytery having to decide this group or this group at that point. And there may not be a, what is it, the language when I read it, is to seek a mediation or otherwise. And that may not be possible. It should be tried, and I would hope that's part of what we meant by a discernment team, is that they will work with all parties to see if we can't find something that's going to be mutually agreeable, not only to the two parties, but also to the presbytery. It becomes a three-way at that point. Okay? And all I do is hope you've elected good people for the discernment teams. Kathy?
Well, it seems like a kind of unsaid issue here is if you're minority, if you get a significant minority and they get the property, they've got to be able to afford to run the church. So if you've got 5 people, unless they each are worth a whole lot of money, it's not happening here.
If I were still the stated clerk, which I remind you I'm not, that's one of the things I would be working with the discernment team is what are going to be the criteria that you use to determine whether or not you want to recommend to the presbytery that a minority be granted the property. If you remember the discernment process, there's about a page and a half of data that has to be collected as part of the whole process. Past budgets, assets, interest, insurance, all kinds of things in there, which is part of the raw data that the discernment team has to kind of sort through. One of those, it seems to me, would be, okay, I've got a group of folk who say they want to remain in the Presbyterian Church USA, and they're asking for the property. The question then becomes, can they reasonably sustain themselves as a congregation in this piece of property? Now, we know it's going to cost X amount of money for maintenance. It's going to cost... It's my son in Illinois, I can tell you. He gets the Woody Woodpecker, guys. I know who it is. You're going to have insurance. You're going to have maintenance. You're going to have upkeep. I mean, if you've got a staff of, it takes 10 people just to do the maintenance. You've got to process that. So I think that's all part of what it is. Now, that said, the discernment teams may also come together and say, you know, we've got 75 people over here, and we've got 30 people over here, and we've got 20 people here, and we've got 18 people here. The question becomes, now do we have a congregation in search of a piece of property? All right? That's part of the whole discernment that has to take place. What are all the options and variables? And none of us knows what all those options and variables are. Okay? Does that help? All right.
What are the ramifications of the straw poll when roughly half the congregation did not vote?
There's a marvelous case goes back to Highland Presbyterian Church in Texas back in early 1990s, where they went through basically the same kind of question. And they had made a determination that they needed a majority vote of the membership. And this was like 1,800, 2,000 people. And they had a vote of like 900 to 300. And that's not a majority of the membership. So that's somewhere the session and congregation have to agree how they're going to factor that in. Like I said, you are not in Robert's rules. I have to keep coming back to you on that. Because it is not an action for a congregation to take. So you can create your own at that point. And whatever they may set, that what we need is a majority of those present and voting. Now I will warn you, the one place that probably, since it's not Robert's rules, it will come into play, and that is there'll be no proxy votes. And that's simply because there are no proxy votes in the Presbyterian Church USA, period. And there's a basic fundamental reason for that, and that is you cannot be part of the discussion and the debate if you are not present. And so you cannot have your mind changed if you're not there. Okay?
So is it up to the discernment committee though to evaluate that half the congregation didn't participate or perhaps isn't even in, so to speak?
Yeah, that's part of the whole, it'll probably be the presbytery that ultimately, because the information will be presented from the discernment team to the presbytery. And they can say, it's one thing to say that there was a 60% of the congregation voted to dismiss, and that was 90% of the vote of those present, which leaves 40%, and we haven't got the slightest clue where those other 40% are. Then presbytery has to make its decision. It can also say we have a petition from 80% of those who were not there that they did not show up because it was their way of protesting against it, and they have a petition saying they want to remain. The variables, I mean, we can spin off forever and ever and ever on it, okay? That's part of the way was the problem for setting up the discernment teams. Way in the back's been waiting.
If I understand your answer to the question about the results of the congregational vote, the session does not have to accept those results.
That's correct. Pardon? This is not a democracy. Presbyterian Church has always been a republic. We are a republic in the same way the United States is not a democracy, it's a republic. Tom?
Seeing as how it's a republic, is there a list of dumb things that sessions do? It's in book form.
My thing's not coming in book. It's right behind Doug's chair.
Just dumb things you can do during a discernment process.
Stated clerks, like lawyers, have the classic comeback that stupidity is not a chargeable offense. Okay? So, no, there is not a list. But I am sure that in the next year there will probably be a list created, and it probably will be several sessions who will say, we really did something stupid here. Okay? This is new territory. There is no handbook. There is no guide for how you do it. We've got 170 presbyteries, and every one of them is doing it differently. So it's we're flying by seat of the pants, and everybody has to give everybody a lot of room in there. Okay? Over here.
I'm not aware of this situation, so I'm just asking.
Hypothetically speaking.
And just following some of the conversation that's been gone forward so far. You have a reasonable group of people, a reasonable number of people within a congregation who want to remain at that church and remain in the Peace USA, whereas the larger group has already indicated they want to leave and take the church with them. Does that reasonably sized small group who wants to stay in the Peace USA and has been part of that church have a leg up on the process or not?
Let me make sure we clarify. There's a reasonable number and there are reasonable people. All right? And those are two distinct categories. No. The way the form of government is written is that there's always an attempt to try to find a way to deal with this other than a either-or vote. But if it comes to an either-or vote, then you're going to have all those factors are going to be at play here. I mean, it's everything from well, I'll tell you what, St. Andrew folks, mind if I use you as an example? One of the issues for St. Andrews is going to be that they have a rather sizable debt on their property. Laguna Beach, if they were to decide to go that way, also does. So that's going to be a factor in there that won't be in play at either Anaheim, St. Paul, or at Lakewood. They do not have multi-million-dollar debts in there. So the ability of a minority to handle that kind of a debt becomes a factor, okay? If there is no debt, then it doesn't take nearly as many people to be able to manage it. So those are, and that's just one. There are going to be a whole series of these variables that have to be absorbed, and it's one of the reasons the property or the whole discernment process is set up. The presbytery will have 2 meetings on discernment. The first meeting will be the information and the facts and the debate. The second meeting is where the vote comes. That's because the group anticipated that there are going to be all kinds of variables. You could spend 4 hours dealing with one congregation's request for dismissal if it gets all complicated with minorities and properties and everything else in there. Could also take 5 minutes. Okay? Does that get it? Have one.
If you have a substantial minority, but it's not organized, okay, they're just out there, and it comes to the discernment process, is that question asked of the majority? Do you know how many are going to go with you? Do you have enough to swing the deal, to manage your property and keep going?
Does the majority or does the minority have enough people?
Does the majority? In other words, the majority, you know who the majority is, but there's an unorganized minority that is a substantial number. And you come to that discernment process.
Yeah.
And is that church really going to be healthy enough if they are allowed to get the property?
The question becomes, how do you service whether or not there is a substantial minority. That can be done in a number of different ways, but the key is that there have to be at least a group of people who asks the discernment team to provide some venue that allows those who want to remain in the Presbyterian Church USA to meet and see how many of them there are. Okay? Now that can be done in a number of ways, but it's one thing if 10 people say there are 100 people in this congregation that we know of, and we want a chance to meet, and you call a meeting and 15 people show up. Now we've got an idea of what we're talking about. It's another thing if those 10 people say it and 150 people show up. This is interesting, okay? And that discernment team is going to have to then go back and really begin discerning. What do we do? What is the proper process in this congregation? All right?
Well, I don't think I worded it very well.
Okay.
I'm talking about the majority gets to go.
Okay.
But in the process, they lose a lot of the congregation who want to stay, but they're disorganized. I would think that there would be questions, are you going to have enough people to cover the budget and run this operation?
If they are dismissed, it's not the Presbytery of Los Ranchos' problem.
They don't care.
Well, they care, and they certainly hope it can, but the Presbytery of Los Ranchos is not the folk who are going to have to deal with that, all right? And that's not to say they don't care or anything else. It's just that's where it's going to come out. I've got one over here who hasn't asked anything, and then there's one over there. Okay.
Not really asking a question, but just making a comment. It would seem to me that if a session is really doing their job, they would consider all the aspects before they initiate the letter or authorize the letter. If I'm on a session and 40% of the congregation has voted no, they want to stay, I'm going to vote no, I want to stay, whether I want to or not, because I don't want to split the congregation.
Okay.
And I think a responsible session would have those kind of considerations before they submit the letter.
From what I got most of the requests for consideration came through my office while I was still the stated clerk. Most of them came with a narrative and a timeline of all the things they had done. And to the best of my knowledge, all of our 11 churches have spent the past year in very long conversations and discussions and open meetings and what have you, in terms of trying to discern where their congregation is. So I would say my experience with reading those is that all 11 of our sessions have done their homework before making this request.
That's not the case.
Pardon?
That's not the case.
Okay. I'm just saying there's a lot of opportunities, and they sense that there's at least a pretty substantial majority who wants to go that direction. Now, it may not be, but that's up to the dissidents to try to help the presbytery find a way to get that serviced. All right?
It's also up to the dissidents to make their session aware of it.
That's correct. Where was the other person? Oh, okay, Bruce.
To the end game. The way the procedure works is session request dismissal. You go through the discernment. It goes to the presbytery. Presbytery decides to grant it, and now someone has to decide whether to accept what the presbytery is offering, the resolution. How is that accepted? Does session do it? Does congregation do it?
Which decision do they have to accept?
It will come to the presbytery to decide whether to grant dismissal, and then the congregation has 90 days to act on it by policy. But is it done by then, or it sounds like the congregation or some body here comes and act on it?
Once the presbytery has voted to dismiss, the congregation is dismissed. The only thing they can vote is to reconsider their request to be dismissed. As far as the presbytery is concerned, once they've acted to dismiss, that congregation is dismissed to whoever they've been dismissed to. That's it. Now, if it's that it's given it to a sizable minority, hopefully they've done their homework to know that that minority does want the property and does want to remain a congregation. If they haven't done that ahead of time, then they did not do their homework. All right? Wait a minute, I've got Tom and then I'll come back up.
There seems
Rick.
to be a disagreement in your assessment of the process of the 11 congregations, even in this room. And so I'm wondering, are sessions responsible to use their copy machine, their office staff, everything throughout the whole process to make sure that a substantial minority has communication facilities, just as the presbytery has for the last 12 months?
I would go back to the issue of transparency and cooperative to the extent that is possible. And it would seem to me, if I were a presbyter meeting when a recommendation comes for dismissal, and there's a sizable group of the people who come and say, we were stonewalled, we were denied access, we couldn't meet on the church premises, we couldn't do this, we couldn't do that. That's not going to sit real favorably with me as a presbyter. All right? Now, that's just me as a person. All right? So I would hope that when you come to the presbytery, folk can say, yes, we had a full hearing, we've had an opportunity, there's been a cooperative spirit, we just came out on different places. And we need help determining what's going to happen with the property now. And once the property's resolved, we wish each other the very best. We have friends in both groups. We love the people we've gotten to know. We are going to be heartbroken that some of our best friends are going there, and this group's going to say we're unhappy that some of our friends are going here. We wish it weren't so, but it is. All right, Rick.
Two things. Number one, talking about when it comes before the floor of the presbytery, and then the church has 90 days to accept it. When it comes to the floor of the presbytery, all the terms and conditions have already been spelled out. Not yeah, that's okay, they can leave, and then sometime down the road we'll worry about the property part and all that.
Oh, no.
It's like the judge approving the divorce, not negotiating. And so that'll all be taken care of in advance. And the other thing, I just wanted to echo what I seem to hear from the rest of the room. And I certainly can't speak for all because I don't know all, but some of the things that I'm hearing, some of the discernment that's already happened may not have been discernment, but rather attempt to justify a decision that was made.
Correct.
That could be. I would comment, what was it somebody had said that I wanted to reflect back on? It'll come back to me. I'll go back to Michael. It'll come to me.
Yeah, thank you, Keith. Again, a lot of the questions that I hear seem to come out of congregational assumptions. Assumptions that a congregation is a free agent that can affiliate here or there, whatever the majority wants, rather than real understanding of Presbyterian polity. If I were a member of the discernment team, and I'm not, but if I were, I would be asking the question, if the Presbytery decides not to dismiss, how many people will leave? Because then the people who don't leave, that's your viable congregation. That's the one you're assessing, whether that's a viable congregation or not. And I don't know how many of the votes that the straw vote people have taken have built that question into them.
I don't either. Like I said, Presbytery has not been invited to be part of very many of those conversations. So that I can't tell you how much of that has been explored.
Is that usual?
Oh, Michael, can you speak louder for some of the folk what your question was?